Welcome, humanoids, to Lecture 3 in our course, Philosophy 2600, Ethics and Science. This lecture is all about ethics, and I am here with Admiral Akbar, my good buddy, running the technology. You wonder, what do professors do in their offices, their home offices, in a time of a pandemic? Do we live in this square? No, we're in here, hanging out, playing with our Star Wars toys. So there you go. All right, let's jump into it. See if Akbar, help me out, buddy. Why is this not working? Already technology problems. Oh, there we go. Okay. What are we going to do today? And as always, consult your lecture notes that I'll post for an outline. Might be a good idea to download those or just a Word document if you want to keep notes from the readings or from these videos. You could just insert them there. It's kind of got a ready-made structure. And of course, you could make the structure however you want it because you can just edit that document. Anyways, today I want us to get us thinking about ethics, some of the fundamental questions. Who are we? What's the right thing to do? What's a good life? What is a just society? We're all doing ethics all the time. Ethics in a way is like the economics of the soul. You have a limited resource. You have a limited amount of time on this planet. How are you going to spend it? What's the best way to lead your life? That's what ethics is all about. So that's our objective. How we're going to do this, how we're going to get thinking about these questions. Well, I want to start with a slide or two on the human condition. What is it that makes us moral agents? That is, why do we have to do ethics? Basically, because we have freedom and we're capable of thinking. Then I want to make this fundamental distinction between the law or convention on one hand and ethics on the other hand. What is and what should be. And that's going to be the key for trying to make a distinction between just and unjust laws. And most of the time today, I want to spend on Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which I reread every year. And I just think there's been books and books and books and courses on ethics, right? But in a way, if you just read that letter with great care, everything you need to know about ethics in a way is in there. I just think it's brilliant. And it's a great thing to start thinking about ethics with. Okay, enough of that. The human condition. So the first thing I wanted to say is, what is it about us? And it may not be us exclusively. Maybe some animals are wrestling with ethical questions. I don't know. I'm not a cat or a bat. I'm not sure. Maybe robots now or in the future. Humanoids like Admiral Akbar, I would say, is in that category. Why do we have to do ethics? Well, because we're free. We're doomed to be free. Okay? We're not controlled by fixed action pattern instincts. We're not a computer where you put in one input and an output automatically comes out. We have this freedom. I like this picture of there's, I guess, a depiction of Adam thinking, well, should I eat that apple or not? We have to think these thoughts. And we live with others. That means our actions impact others. We have to take account of the people, or maybe more than people around us, that have moral value that need to be taken into consideration. And we have these ideals. I'm a big fan of Alexander Hamilton ever since I saw the I don't know if you've seen the play, but you should definitely watch it if you haven't. But just as an example, that's somebody fighting for more than just life. He's fighting for freedom, justice, right? For a form of government grounded in the will of the people. So we all, I think, have ideals that motivate us. Okay, so this is the ethical condition. This is the human condition. Now, do we have the capacities to do this? First and foremost, it's about thinking. You have to think to do ethics. You can't just blindly follow. And that's going to be really the theme of today. What else are our capacities? What's part of thinking? Thinking is reason. I put it there, definitely. A logical, open-minded inquiry, critical assessment, but also our shared sentiment, our moral imagination, our conscience, and especially our empathy. You might be interested to know that Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, he put empathy at the very center of his moral philosophy or his ethics. And I want to say, most of all, thinking, it requires courage. Courage is the virtue that enables all of the other virtues. It's what allows us to do the right thing. Right? You've got to have courage. And we'll talk later on about virtue ethics as a theory, a normative theory of ethics that talks about the character of the people doing the deciding and the acting as what's most important in ethics. Okay, so that's the human condition. We're free and we're thinking. Now, if you don't know of Hannah Arendt, you should stop whatever you're doing and go out and read about her and read some of her work. In my opinion, the greatest thinker of the 20th century. She was a German-American philosopher, spent a lot of her time at the New School in New York. This in German, niemand hat das Recht zu gehorchen, means no one has the right to obey. She, if you've ever heard of Adolf Eichmann, she covered the trial of Eichmann. Eichmann was a Nazi functionary who basically kept the trains running to the concentration camps on time. And she took a lot of flack from the Jewish community, of which she was a member, for saying that Eichmann actually wasn't a monster. He wasn't some unusually depraved, evil creature. He was a normal guy. He just was thoughtless. He wasn't thinking. He didn't think about the bigger picture, the consequences of his action. He didn't take responsibility for his actions as a result of him just unthinkingly following orders. I was just following orders, he says. I was supposed to get the train from point A to point B. I did a good job at that, right? What's wrong? I didn't kill anybody, you know? So Arendt spent really her entire career thinking about thinking, right? Philosophical ethics concerns the reasons for or against the laws or the conventions of a society. It's not good enough to just say, I was following orders, or I was just doing what everybody else is doing. You can't just conform or obey. You have to think. That's the difficult business of being a human. So you have to think about not just what people are doing around you and what they believe, but whether they should be doing that, whether you should be following them and doing that or not. And in doing that thinking, what you're looking for is some standard, some measure, some point of view from above where you can evaluate your own culture and other cultures in ways of being and ask yourself, are some better than others? What's the right way of being? Now, this is a great example for this class. I didn't assign this to you. Sometimes I do in this course. It's worth looking up Stanley Milgram's experiment in 1963. We might come back around to it because this is a scientific experiment in psychology that involves human participants, which is going to be a section in our course. And there's been a lot of talk about whether this was actually an ethical experiment to do. And I don't think it would get approved nowadays because it involved deception and it caused quite a bit of trauma to the people who were involved in this study. But basically you had an experimenter, that's E up here, who was in on the study, and a learner who was also an actor in on the study. And the volunteer who was clueless about what was going on was called a teacher, T. And the experimenter would be like wearing a white coat, looking like an authority figure, a scientific authority figure, would tell the teacher that we're in a study to see the effect of punishment on learning. And the teacher was working a machine with buttons and levers connected by wires to the learner, who was kind of in another room separated here by, well, they had different versions of it, a pane of glass or a wall. And if the learner again, the learner is an actor and was not connected to a machine with voltage on it, but the teacher didn't know that, right? So if the learner got an answer wrong, the experimenter told the teacher, well, you got to zap them. And so they started with small voltage. And the learner, who was an actor, again, would go, ah! And then they'd ask another question. And if you got it wrong, They'd turn up the voltage and the experimenter would say, gotta zap them again. And then the learner started going, oh, you're really screaming, you know? And they kept going, turning up the voltage to extreme levels at a point where the learner starts complaining. And again, the learner was an actor, starts complaining about, oh, my heart, I don't feel good. I can't do this anymore. Please stop. And sadly, Milgram found the majority, even 60% of the teachers, again, who were the ones who didn't know what was actually going on, 60% of them went all the way to the highest voltage. This was extremely disturbing. You can read more about this. People have replicated it and sometimes even got worse results insofar as like more people even go all the way to the extreme. I put up this long quote here because it's worth looking at. The essence of obedience, he says, is that a person comes to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes. In other words, you stop being a person. You stop being a thinking being and you say, I'm going to delegate my responsibility for my agency, for my action, for my thinking to somebody else. If the experimenter says this is what we got to do, I'll do it, right? And there's this, Milgram wrote about this later in the Obedience to Authority, said this is a disturbing feature of the human condition. Now, he did note there were some sterling characters. He quotes one woman at length who, when the experimenter said to zap the learner, she just turns around and says, I'm not going to do that. And he goes, you must do it. The experiment commands that you do it. And she says, no, I'm not going to do it. You know, we're here of our own free will. He doesn't want to get zapped. I don't want to zap him, right? And the experimenter kept saying, well, you have to do it. This is the experiment. She said, no, I don't have to do it, right? But that was the minority of people who had that reaction, actually. That was a disturbing thing. His hypothesis that most people would act that way, but that's not what he found. Now, that bottom quote there, you could imagine different ways of running this experiment. For example, when the experimenter was on a phone calling in the directions, fewer people obeyed the orders because there was a sense of separation from your commanding your commanding authority figure. When there were other teachers who were actors also, and they started refusing to do the voltage shocks, then the real teacher who wasn't in on it would also refuse. So there's this kind of follower effect. But this bottom quote was, when you had more degrees of separation between the teacher and the shock that was being administered, there was greater and greater willingness to obey and do the shocks all the way to the end. So because there was a sense of, I'm just one cog in a machine, or I'm just one link in a chain, and so I'm not responsible for the whole thing, right? Okay, enough on that. Here's the fundamental distinction that I want you to put in your brain for this class and for the whole course. The distinction between convention or law on one hand and ethics on the other hand. Convention or law. What is the case? How do people act? What do people believe? Ethics. What should be the case? How people should act? What people should believe? Ethics is, at least on some level, the attempt to distinguish between just and unjust laws, to find some way, a standard, a measure, a point of view, to look at the laws and conventions and practices of your society and say, those ones are good and those ones are bad. Those ones are fair and those ones are unfair. That's what we're trying to do. Okay. Martin Luther King Jr., we're going to get to him. This is the way he puts it. There's two types of laws, just and unjust. And you have a duty to obey just laws, but you have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Think about the Milgram experiment. They have a moral responsibility to disobey the experimenter who's telling them they have to go on. You must go on. The experiment demands it. We have to do it. No, we don't, right? I have freedom, and I'm thinking about this, and this is wrong, right? Okay, this is a long-running, perennial feature of the human condition. So we should expect to see it pop up in lots of places, and I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, and then we're going to dive deep into Letter from a Birmingham Jail, because I think that's just one of the most sterling examples of this question, this fundamental distinction within ethics. So this is from Sophocles' Antigone. There's a civil war. One of the brothers kills the other brother. The father, the king Creon, declares that the brother who was killed shall not receive a proper burial. Well, the daughter, Antigone, the sister to the brothers, goes out and gives him a burial anyways. Creon is furious and calls her in and says, "You knew my order not to do this." And she said, "Yeah, I knew it." And Creon says, "But you still dare to disobey me?" And Antigone says, "Yeah, but for me it wasn't Zeus who made that order, nor did that justice who lives with the gods below mark out such laws. Nor did I think your orders were so strong that you, a mortal man, could overrun the gods' unwritten and unfailing laws." She's looking for a higher standard, a timeless standard, by which to judge even the decrees of the king and say, "No, that was unjust. I know what justice is and what it calls for." Those of you who are Christian might find this example interesting. This is from Dostoevsky. It's a story called The Grand Inquisitor, which is originally in the Brothers Karamazov, but it's been pulled out as kind of a story on its own. And it tells a story, a make-believe story. During the Inquisition in medieval Europe, Jesus actually comes back to Earth. And the Grand Inquisitor, who's in charge of rounding up heretics and punishing them and making them confess the true ways of the faith, the Grand Inquisitor grabs up Jesus, who's been claiming, "Hey, I'm Jesus." And the Inquisitor says to him, "Actually, I know that you're Jesus, but I'm still going to punish you and keep you in this jail cell because you screwed it up. When you refuse the temptations of the devil to prove that you are in fact God, you made people have to use their own thinking. You gave them their freedom to decide whether they're going to believe or not believe. And guess what?" The Grand Inquisitor says, "People don't want their freedom." Okay? It's torturing them. They just want somebody to tell them what to believe. Okay. So that's one other version of this. Third and final one, and we'll talk about this later in the course too, crimes against humanity. This is the Nuremberg trials. After the Nazis were defeated in World War II, there was an international tribunal to try to come up with some standards to judge and convict many of the high-level Nazi functionaries of crimes. But because, as MLK says, everything that the Nazis were doing in Germany was illegal, and everybody who was resisting them within the growing Nazi empire, everything they were doing was illegal, they had to find some standard to appeal to this international tribunal that wasn't the laws in place in the nation at the time. They were looking for a, quote, suprapositive principle. That is, not a principle that was posited by humans at a particular time and a place within this nation. Because again, that convention can be unjust, as it certainly was in Nazi Germany. They were trying to appeal to a suprapositive. It's like Antigone saying, it wasn't Zeus who made that law. She's looking for Zeus. They're like looking for Zeus, some sort of suprapositive principle to appeal to. And they came up with this idea of crimes against humanity. That nobody, no nation, no matter what your laws are, you can't treat people the way they were treated in Nazi Germany. You have to treat them with dignity and respect. What would you do in Nazi Germany? I think that's a good question. MLK in this letter says, "I'm sure I would have given aid to my Jewish brethren," and I'm sure he would have too. But he also says, all too many people are cautious rather than courageous. There's courage again, right? They would have remained silent, and they have remained silent behind the security of their stained glass windows, just like the Milgram experiment. Well, I'm not actually in the same room with this learner, right? I can kind of ignore that. I would rather have a negative piece, the way MLK puts it, rather than a positive piece. Okay, sadly, shortly before I'm recording this lecture, we lost an American hero, John Lewis, who was the youngest speaker on that day when MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech, who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and had his skull bashed in by the police, who received the Medal of Freedom from President Obama, and was a long-serving member of the US Congress who was known as the conscience of the Congress. The way he put it, sum up this whole lecture, good trouble, right? If you see something that's wrong, you got to say something about it, and you got to do something about it. Good trouble is like the constructive tension, when you call out an injustice and you stand up to it. Bad trouble is just being a petty, selfish criminal, right? But that's not what these guys are talking about. Here's somebody who got in good trouble, right? Okay, so finally, MLK. Let's see how he puts this fundamental distinction. But first, a little bit of context. This came out April 13th, 1963. Hopefully you're aware of that era in the American South in particular, of the Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation, second-class citizenship on African Americans, systemic racism, police brutality. So not just racism enshrined in the laws, although it was, but enshrined in culture, in the way people believed and behaved, even enshrined in the way people could get loans from the bank, where they could live, what was acceptable, and a lot of brutality and violence. Now, what was going more specifically around this time? So the civil rights movement, right? And a lot of tension boiling over. In Birmingham at the time, the judge had prohibited peaceful demonstrations. MLK and others marched and were arrested on April 12th. On that same day, 8 white Alabama clergy published a call for unity. Somebody got hold of this and was able to smuggle it into Martin Luther King Jr.'s jail cell, where he read it. He did not like it, and he started writing something that he called originally Why We Can't Wait, but it became a letter from a Birmingham jail. On the margins of a newspaper, it's all he had at the time. Eventually, his lawyers were able to get him a pad of legal paper so he could write it out properly. And what you read for this class, his letter, just kind of flowed out of him while he's sitting in his jail cell. This is one thing it tells you is just how bright and brilliant this man was, that this could just sort of flow out of him under those conditions. And what he's doing is it's a condemnation of what he calls the white moderate and their acceptance of a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, even though it's an absence because people are being brutally oppressed, marginalized, repressed. He says we shouldn't want a negative peace. We should have a positive peace where we actually have justice. Okay, so I'll go through you can read the essay and you need to do it with care on your own. But let me just quickly skim through an outline of what's going on here. So civil disobedience is breaking the law in the name of a higher law. For this to ever work, for it to be justified, there's got to be two things going on. One is that distinction we're talking about. There has to be such a thing as just laws versus unjust laws. It can't be that all laws are just. And second, somebody, in this case MLK, would have to have knowledge of this distinction, right? And of course, not just MLK, but you, hopefully, everybody, the people he's marching with, the people he's writing the letter appealing to, the white moderates. We all have to be able to see this distinction and make it so that we can know what's the right thing to do, when to obey and when not to obey. So again, ethics concerns the reasons for and against the conventions of a society. I already put that up, but it's so important. You have to think. You can't just conform. You can't just say, well, that's what everybody else is doing. The way he put it, he said, look, I've heard a lot of Southern religious leaders say, okay, well, desegregation, we should follow that because it's the law. No, don't follow desegregation because it's the law. Follow it because it's the right thing to do, because it's an affirmation of our brotherhood or our common humanity. Right? That's what he's saying. That's the reason to follow desegregation. So how can we make this distinction between just and unjust laws? What kind of reasons can we give? In other words, what's that standard? You know, we saw Antigone say, well, I got Zeus. I'm going to appeal to Zeus's law. This, by the way, is the beginning historically of philosophical ethics. So when I think about the ancient Greeks, what's going on is not just that they observed diversity. They didn't just say, oh, the Egyptians and the Spartans and the people in Thrace and the people in Mykonos and the people over there in Sicily and the people in Athens, they all have different ways of living. They observe diversity. But the philosophical question is then to say, are some better than others? By what standard, right? How could we come in that determination? That's what we're trying to do. MLK says that all the great fools, quote unquote, of history have to give an account, an apology of what we're doing, of why is it that I'm not conforming, right? Plato talks about stepping out of the cave of conventions to see the form of justice itself. That's another metaphor for this, looking for a standard. Okay, so quickly, MLK offers several ways to distinguish just and unjust laws. And you got to go through the text to see these. Maybe a just law is one where our human posited laws square with the law of God, like Zeus, right? This is known as the divine command theory of morality. We might touch on this a little bit later. It's tricky, and I'm not sure it really works. Because what if God commands something that's unjust, right? Okay, how about a just law is a human-made law that squares with natural law? Natural law, by the way, is sort of undergirding much of the American legal system and constitution, that nature is something we can appeal to, our human nature. We're all born equal, right? But one of the tricky things in this class when we're talking about ethics and science is, doesn't modern science tell us that nature is just a collection of resources and it doesn't actually inform us about who we should be? Okay, well, maybe a just law is one that respects our shared personhood or dignity, one that recognizes an essential sameness that we all have. This is another thing he talks about in here. And this, we might talk about this a little bit later, is a deontological theory of morality, in the sense that we are all members of the kingdom of ends. We all must be treated as ends in ourselves and not as mere means to be used towards somebody else's ends. We all have something essentially dignifying, intrinsically valuable about us, and a just law has to recognize and honor that and protect it. Okay. Maybe a just law, he says, is one that squares with our conscience. Our conscience is that thinking. It's that two-in-one nature. This is from Hannah Arendt. I put her picture up earlier. It's that conversation you have in your head, where you're a thinking being, right? You're trying to ascend from the cave of public dogma, what everybody else around you is doing, to conscience would be this private knowledge, this conviction, this authenticity, that, you know what, even though I'm going to jail and everybody's sicking the dogs at me and people are bashing in my head on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I know I'm right. Okay, that's what he's talking about here. And this also has a long history. Socrates says it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. Okay, apply that to MLK, right? I'm not going to be complicit in an immoral system, even though I might be more or less comfortable in my way of life within the limited things I'm allowed to do. No, I'd rather go get my head bashed in, get thrown in a jail cell. And Socrates and Kant both say, why? Because I don't want to live with a criminal. That internal conversation you've got, that person you're thinking with, you can never get away from them. That's you, right? So in some way, you just want to have a clean conscience. But the problem is, sometimes we lie to ourselves, don't we? We rationalize things. Maybe we do this all the time. We find maybe we're doing heinous things, or at least icky things, but we find a way to talk our way through it. It's not that bad. So maybe conscience isn't the answer, if conscience can be so easily corrupted, Maybe your conscience can be wrong. Maybe you can, in other words, talk yourself in that internal conversation. It becomes inauthentic and lazy, right? Maybe you just internalize whatever people are telling you and then you mistake it for your own voice. So how do we have a society that fosters a good conscience or a right one? Okay, but there's more in this letter. I'm telling you, it's so rich. So he says, well, maybe a just law is a code that the majority crafts and also follows. The majority doesn't make it and only apply it to the minority. One way to say this is nobody's above the law. Everybody has equal treatment before the law. Like cases are treated alike. He also says a just law is a constitutional law. Now that does beg the question, is the Constitution just? Okay, that's a good question, I think. In his I Have a Dream speech, MLK says, America is basically a promissory note. Look, we were founded on the principle that everybody's created equal. And we all have a right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness and life, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This is the promise. So all I'm doing, he says, MLK, is I'm calling in that check. I'm cashing in that check. You know, this is in the Constitution. So that's one way to think about it. Another one, which is sort of woven throughout, right, is a just law makes distinctions only on the basis of morally relevant criteria. In his I Have a Dream speech, he says, judge me not by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character. In other words, a just law would be one that sets us up to judge people and make distinctions only on morally relevant criteria. Your skin color, that's not relevant. Your gender, say, that's not relevant. In many cases, your country of origin isn't relevant. But if you want to be a surgeon, well, your degree, your skill set, your experience, that is relevant. And we should only have laws that allow certain people to become surgeons, right? So yeah, we need to make distinctions, but they need to be on morally relevant criteria. Okay, last one, I think, and this one kind of too nebulously throughout. A just law is one that results from a just process. How about that? So if you have a process that's inclusive, that people who are effective have a voice, right? That's rational, that's fair, then whatever results would be a just law. Maybe that's a way to think about it. And the letter that he's writing is an act of interpersonal reason giving, right? So in the very medium that he's using, language, reason giving, he is embodying this way of thinking about a just law. Let's come up with laws where we convince each other for good reasons that these are the right things to do. Now, a quick note here. What's missing? Well, we'll get to this, but utilitarianism, or this idea that a just law is one that would maximize happiness. Why might that not be something he appeals to? Well, because maybe the majority would be happier if the minority is oppressed. And maybe their happiness would outweigh the misery of the minority. Even if that were the case, that's no way to judge whether a law is just or unjust. It's not about some sort of positive negative balance on misery if it allows a great deal of suffering and misery to result. We'll talk more about that in a future lecture. Okay, getting towards the end here. So those are just ways that are in that letter to think about this distinction between just and unjust laws. It's why he's using ethics to evaluate his own society, which is an act of thinking that our condition of being free compels us into, right? What about the tactics and the strategies used? So you could do a whole, and people do a whole course on direct action and nonviolence. You know, this Gandhi was very influential for Martin Luther King Jr. on this. And he says, look, you have to gather the facts. You can't just go knee-jerk, willy-nilly, fighting against something that you haven't done the due diligence to figure out what's going on here, what's wrong about it. So you have to have fact gathering. You need to negotiate, and he talks about in the letter. Well, we postponed our action because we wanted to have this a chance to talk with somebody. We wanted the election to go through and see how that shook out, and blah. So you have to have fact gathering, negotiation, and then maybe most importantly, self-purification, he says. You have to ask yourself, am I going to be doing these things for the right reason? If I want to sit at a lunch counter with people yelling at me, spitting on me, hitting me, why am I doing that? Am I doing it because I'm looking for a fight? Because if that's it, I'm not doing it for the right reason. Am I doing it because I want to get in the newspaper? I'm not doing it for the right reason. If I'm doing this so that me and my kids have our basic human rights, I'm doing it for the right reason, right? So that's part of the self-purification. And he says what we're doing with direct action is creative, constructive tension. And what he doesn't like about the white moderates is, again, is they were okay with this sort of negative peace and absence of tension. But it was an absence of tension only because people were being so brutally oppressed that the white moderate could go about their life and say, oh, everything's fine, you know? No, it's not. And it's time, he's saying, to call that out. But what I want to get you thinking about is, what about violence? You know, is it ever called for? Or property destruction? Um, should those ever be part of a campaign towards justice? You know, and if so, under what conditions? Last thing for you to think about is, are there injustices today? So do you believe in moral progress, right? Do you think we're better off now, let's say in America, than during the Jim Crow era? If you do, you're making a claim about moral progress. And if you're doing that, then you're saying, yeah, there are standards that we can apply, universal, timeless standards that we could apply to different cultures in different moments in a culture's history to see whether they're progressing or regressing. So what are those measures that you're using? And if you don't believe in moral progress, are you saying that every society, no matter what their practices, is equally just or unjust? That it's all, as it were, relative, something that we'll get to in a later lecture. Now, a thought to leave you with. Are there things going on today in your society? Think about it even from a small level. Think about your own interpersonal and family life. Okay, ethics applies on all levels, all the way up to the nation state, all the way up to the globe, planet Earth. Are there things happening now? Widespread beliefs, practices, conventions, laws that are just wrong, unfair, unjust? And are there things you're just sort of unthinkingly allowing to happen? That we're all maybe just unthinkingly allowing to happen? I mean, in other words, are there things that your grandchildren are going to look back and say, I can't believe you were complicit with that, right? What is it? I've got some things in mind, maybe, but I want you to think about that for yourself. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. Please do read the MLK text. And remember what our good friend Admiral Akbar, hero of the resistance, says: critical thinking kills fascism. And until next time, may the force be with you.